Unaware that the young black girl is a White House insider, police treat her disrespectfully in court. "Are you lost, my love?" The officer's smirk hardly concealed the disdain in his speech. There was no flinch from Tiana Wallace. The subtle insults, the silent humiliations, the way he and others thought she didn't belong, she had heard it all before. They didn't know who they were up against this time, though. They witnessed a young black woman defending her cousin in court. They failed to see the information, contacts, and authority she possessed, as well as the White House ID that was discreetly stored in her purse. And the same individuals who made fun of her would be pleading for forgiveness by the time the truth was out. Tiana Wallace was 8 years old when she stood on the National Mall and saw the sun sparkle off the marble summit of the Washington Monument. On a windy spring afternoon, her father, Anthony, had taken her there to demonstrate to her that the very center of America was more than simply a destination for visitors and high-ranking officials. For common people with aspirations and goals, it represented home. "You'll do something important here, Tiana, right here in this city," he said, softly placing a hand on her back. In addition to affection, his voice conveyed unwavering conviction. It wasn't always easy growing up in Southeast Washington, D.C. On some days, Tiana heard the sirens' cries more frequently than the lovely birdsong before dawn. Some evenings, while drifting in and out of her mother's soft lullabies, she completed her homework by the soft glow of the kitchen light. Tiana maintained her composure while her peers raced the streets and became entangled in hazardous crowds. The pages of books she had borrowed from Martin Luther King Jr. gave her comfort. Memorial Library, where her ambition was honed and her imagination nourished by tales of pioneers. Denise, her mother, had 2 jobs. She was an overnight cashier at a grocery store and a daily receptionist at a community center in the area. Tiana felt wealthy in the currency of steadfast support, even while money was scarce. Her mother's perseverance taught her that, if one had the fortitude to stand strong, hardship might serve as a stepping stone rather than a wall. Through community service projects, scholarships, and ultimately being accepted to Howard University, Tiana stood up. Tiana found her interest for social justice and public policy at Howard, which provided the ideal setting for her intense desire to make amends for the injustices she witnessed in her community. She graduated with honors 4 years later and was hailed as a rising star by both classmates and faculty for fusing intelligence with empathy. Tiana received an opportunity to work in the White House's Office of Public Engagement, following a brief internship at the Department of Education. For Tiana, what appeared unlikely to others seemed like a logical step forward, a flowering fulfillment of her father's destiny. She never carried herself in a haughty or self-important manner, but she was, in fact, accomplishing something significant in this city. She carried out her responsibilities with humility and an unwavering willingness to assist, organizing youth outreach initiatives and facilitating access to federal resources for underserved populations. It went unnoticed that this modest young lady, with a tiny physique, tidy braids, and a modest sense of style, was a daily visitor to the White House's famous hallways. At 5:30 a.m., Tiana's alarm went off. As she rarely did, she had taken the day off from work. This Tuesday was not like the others. Mark Freeman, her cousin, was scheduled to appear in the D.C. Superior Court on minor trespassing charges, which Tiana felt were baseless and full of false information. Mark, a 19-year-old who was intelligent but stubborn, had been outside a closed convenience shop after hours, which was the incorrect time and location for him. Because Mark was acting strangely and lingering, the store manager had contacted the police. After a late study session at the University of the District of Columbia, Mark vowed he was just waiting for an Uber. But the arresting officers remained steadfast in their position. They said he appeared to be attempting to break in. It was strange to Tiana that although Mark's phone records made it obvious that he had requested a transport, the police report made no reference to it. Furthermore, the security tape from the convenience shop that may have cleared Mark was oddly not recording. Tiana was aware of how easily prejudices may result in unfair outcomes from her time working on community policing projects while she was employed at the White House. She supported measures that closed the divide between communities of color and law enforcement, as well as accountability and due process. The system that had threatened her relative with an unjustified criminal record was now going to confront her. She was not going to watch helplessly. At the Judiciary Square metro station, Tiana entered the escalator wearing a plain navy blue skirt suit that was professional enough to be taken seriously without being overly gaudy. She held a binder filled with proof, including Mark's phone records, professorial character references, and even statements from university security officers confirming he had been there for classes. Her tummy began to churn with nervousness. She didn't want to go beyond the defense attorney's responsibilities, because she wasn't a lawyer. But for days, she had painstakingly gathered everything that could be useful to Mark. Her job was to get through the hearing without disclosing the huge secret that offered her a unique perspective on the legal system. Unless it was absolutely necessary, she would not mention the White House by name. Because the story might be different if she did. She did not want Mark's independence to be dependent on influence or nepotism. She wanted his innocence to be acknowledged. Tiana tried to calm herself as she entered the D.C. Superior Court through the hefty doors. Lawyers in sharp clothes, weary defendants holding documents, and relatives waiting impatiently for their loved ones filled the building. There were a few bulletin boards with legal notifications on them, and the walls were a plain beige color. There was a slight disinfectant odor in the air. Officers in uniform were seated against the wall across the hall, drinking coffee from paper cups. Tiana became aware of the sidelong glances they gave her, as if they were evaluating her in silence and calculating her value based on preconceived notions. Because of the hue of her skin or the unwavering poise in her posture, she had seen this 1,000 times before, a tall, austere presence looking suspiciously at her. Tiana settled herself on a lonely wooden bench, ready to keep quiet and wait for Mark and his lawyer. But one cop in particular, whose name was T. Parker, appeared to be obsessed with her. He gave his coworker a shove and murmured something that could not be heard. They both burst into quiet giggles. Maybe it was a joke, maybe it wasn't. Tiana's cheeks briefly flushed, but she forced herself to remain calm. She stood up and looked about for directions because she had to go to the bathroom. She heard one of the officers talk in a sharp but quiet voice as she passed the group. "Sweetheart, are you certain you're in the proper place? This is not the welfare check line." Tiana stopped. Slowly, she turned to face the officer. There was no possibility of misinterpretation in the statement. Her race, class, and presence in the courthouse were all directly disparaged. Her breast flared with wrath, but she managed to steady her voice. "I'm sorry." Even though her fury was simmering beneath the surface, she answered calmly. "You might be lost," the officer said with a sly smile. He chuckled half-heartedly. T. Parker, his colleague, put on an apologetic shrug. "We simply do not wish for you to become confused. For those who don't frequently visit, courtrooms can be confusing places." Her jaw tightened as she gazed at them. How simple it was for them to believe she had no dignity or purpose. However, Tiana had no intention of engaging in conflict. She was there for Mark. "Thank you, I know precisely where I'm going," she said firmly before moving on down the corridor without turning around. She could hear the snickers going on behind her. But Tiana's determination grew stronger. She had endured worse: disrespect, bigotry with a thin veneer, and presumptions about her intelligence, and managed to live. She would also have to put up with this. A tiny part of her found comfort in the idea that these officers would feel quite differently if they knew who she really was, even if she wasn't the kind to take advantage of her position. In the bathroom, Tiana let her rage run down her face by splattering cold water on it. She told herself that she was a professional, a representative, albeit a casual one, of an organization that expected her to maintain composure under duress. After drying off, she looked in the mirror and saw the faint furrow in her forehead that would not go away. Returning to the hallway, she saw Alicia Knowles, Mark's defense lawyer, standing with her client. Mark fiddled with his tie as if it were a straitjacket, looking nervous. A middle-aged woman named Alicia raised a hand in greeting, her eyes warm and her demeanor one of practical competence. Alicia remarked, "I really appreciate you coming, Tiana." When Mark saw his cousin, his expression lightened a little. "In fact, you're here." His eyes showed relief as he muttered, "I was concerned that you might not be able to take a break." Tiana smiled reassuringly and shook her head. "I promised to be here. I've also brought some materials that you might find helpful, Alicia." She quickly summarized what she had put together and handed over the binder. Alicia's brows lifted in gratitude. "Tiana, this is amazing. These displays might be useful to me. We're hoping we can convince the court of the truth." She spoke more softly. "But be ready. The hearing may become heated if the officers who detained Mark arrive with a particular mindset." Tiana recalled her recent experience in the hallway and thought that heated was an understatement. The same group of officers had gotten closer to the waiting area, she saw as she looked around. Were they all supposed to testify that morning in various cases? Maybe. You could feel the tension between them, like an unseen thread. Mark pulled at the sleeve of Tiana.
Are you all recht?
Gently, he inquired. She gave a nod. She said, just had a run-in with a couple of them. Nothing is too much for me. Alicia looked at her watch. When the bailiff calls us in, we have roughly 10 minutes. Let's go over the plan again. As Alicia outlined the procedures, highlighting Mark's academic record, providing the phone records, and objecting to any reference to Mark's previous warnings for small transgressions, Tiana noticed her focus returning to the gathering of policemen. She couldn't shake the idea that the confrontation she had just had was just a preview of what was to happen. A voice roared abruptly from the other side of the hall. Do we have a problem? The officer whose name tag Tiana had noticed was T. Parker. Bystanders' attention was drawn to the sharpness in his voice. Startled, Tiana and Alicia turned. No, officer, Alicia said in a businesslike tone. Do you want to talk about something in particular? Parker's gaze grew strained. Simply put, I don't like the way you're staring over here. Speak up if you have anything to say. Tiana put a soothing hand on Mark's arm before he could say anything further. She took a step closer and met Parker's gaze directly. Officer, we're just awaiting our hearing. No more, no less. Like a coiled spring, the tension increased. Alicia knew it was time to defuse the situation. Sir, we're concentrating on the next hearing. We don't mean to offend. I'll bear that in mind, Parker scoffing. Then he pivoted on his heel and muttered something to his friends. Mark was shaking beneath Tiana's palm. She murmured to Mark, leave it alone. We cannot afford to cause a commotion. His jaw was clenched in rage, but he nodded. They began their last-minute preparations after Alicia motioned for them to join her to a more peaceful corner. But even while they talked, Tiana's mind was racing with worries. She felt that the policeman animosity was personal and that they were eager for a fight. There was a part of her that wanted to stomp over and declare, I know exactly how this system works, better than you might imagine, and I know my rights. She didn't say anything, though. Allowing her cousin's attorney to do her work was the best course of action. If Tiana ever made her revelations, it would happen when she wanted to. Tiana's thoughts drifted back to the day she entered the White House as an employee rather than a guest in the silence of that waiting room. She recalled the magnetometers, the stringent security checkpoint outside the Eisenhower Executive Office building, and the methodical Secret Service officials who scanned her bag. She was expecting someone to come out at every opportunity and remark, this must be a mistake, you don't belong here. However, nobody did. Doors opened as she flashed her new ID badge. She was shown into a small office overlooking the White House lawn that first morning. She received a warm welcome from a senior aide who went over the line of command, the duties she would be performing, and the importance of the organization she was now working for. Tiana had experienced an overwhelming sense of responsibility rather than terror. She was a member of a group that influenced programs and policies that affected millions of Americans. She also recalled how cautious she had been, particularly in her former neighborhood, while discussing her work with friends and family. She didn't want to appear arrogant or conceited. She had known individuals who had been crushed by a system that frequently showed little concern for their aspirations. She was now in the center of the country's authority. The most important question was how she might represent individuals who felt forgotten and utilize her voice to heal that division. Tiana gradually gained the respect of her co-workers for her honesty, hard work, and inventiveness. She spearheaded neighborhood-based projects, working with nearby NGOs to increase educational resources for disadvantaged children. She never lost sight of the everyday hardships that lie underneath the formality of policy papers because she kept her ear to the ground. Her hosting of conferences aimed at fostering understanding between police agencies and grassroots organizations gave her first-hand knowledge of law enforcement challenges. Although there had been progress, Tiana was not gullible. She was aware of the pervasiveness of prejudice in society and that each success in closing the trust gap was, at most, a step in the direction of a far-off goal. In a strange turn of events, she was now on the opposite side of the courtroom aisle. Her cousin's life was about to be destroyed by the same police officers whose leadership she might one day work with. I wish they were aware of the irony. If only they were aware that she had been seated across tables from police chiefs, talking about community outreach initiatives and accountability procedures. However, all they saw was a young black woman, much like the thousands who went through the legal system every year. And that, in their opinion, made her inferior to them rather than equal. A bailiff emerged as the entrance to courtroom 4B opened and beckoned everyone involved in Mark Freeman's case inside. After gathering their things, Tiana, Mark, and Alicia filed in and sat down at the defendant's table. A robust assistant district attorney was already arranging notes at the prosecution's desk, which was just across from them. T. Parker and 2 other cops in uniform lingered close by, most likely to provide state witnesses. The judge, a grim-faced lady in her 50s, came in and sat down on the bench. She declared, "We are on the record. Docket number 42938 is the District of Columbia versus Mark Freeman case." As she looked across the room, her attention briefly fell on Tiana, who calmly and respectfully looked into the judge's eyes. Alicia stood up. "Greetings, Your Honor." Alicia Knowles on behalf of the accused. Noting the state's position that Mark had been discovered loitering with the intent to conduct trespassing, the district attorney also introduced himself. With a nod, the judge turned to face Alicia. "How does your client plead, Ms. Knowles?" "Your Honor," Alicia said confidently, "not guilty." As she flipped over her notes, the judge remarked, "All right. I am aware that before we move on, we must take into account a few evidentiary motions." "Yes," Alicia responded, "Your Honor. We intend to provide the defendant's phone log, which demonstrates that he was waiting for an Uber at the relevant moment. His university has also provided us with character statements." The DA got up. "Since these comments are unrelated, we shall argue against their inclusion. The incident itself is not addressed by character declarations, but the phone records may be acceptable." The judge's eyebrows went up. "Are there the officers who responded to the scene as well?" With his shoulders back, T. Parker took a stride forward. "Yes, Officer Parker of the Metropolitan Police Department, Your Honor." He was signaled to take the witness stand by the judge, who nodded. Parker began recounting the events of the evening after being sworn in. "The store manager complained to us about someone skulking around the closed store. We found Mr. Freeman behind the building when we got there. He appeared anxious, as though he were prying something open." Alicia scrawled notes frantically while looking at Tiana, who tightened her jaw at the officer's imaginative depiction. Parker's statement made no reference to Mark's phone. There was no indication of him just waiting for a ride. Parker went on, "I went up to the suspect and asked him what he was doing. He muttered something about a ride and didn't have a clear response, but first refused to show me his phone. I thought he might be playing with the rear door's lock." Tiana's fingernails penetrated her hand. Parker didn't ask to see his phone until he was handcuffed. Mark had informed her, and by then, Mark was too scared to comment. Alicia got to her feet and spoke in a clear, businesslike voice. "Did you discover any equipment for picking locks on Mark Freeman, Officer Parker?" Parker said, "No, but it doesn't mean he didn't have plans to." "Did you discover any indications of a break-in attempt, such as damage to the store's rear entrance?" Parker's lips were pursed. "We got there before he had a chance to do anything, but there was no evident harm." Tiana sensed the courtroom becoming more tense. According to this story, Mark was a potential criminal who was apprehended in time. She wanted to get up, to shout, to show what she had found. But Alicia was responsible for that. She was supposed to keep quiet unless asked to. Despite his lack of enthusiasm, the judge remained silent. Alicia continued. "As well as the security camera of the store manager. Did you or your significant other watch the video that evening?" Parker cleared his throat. "According to the management, the camera wasn't functioning. There was no reason for us to doubt him." Alicia gave the judge a sharp glance. "I get it. Your Honor, no more inquiries." The judge let out a sigh. Any more witnesses may be used by the prosecution. Next, the store manager was contacted by the district attorney, and he told the identical tale. In a panic, he called the police after spotting Mark outside the shuttered store. Alicia presented the phone logs during cross-examination, demonstrating that Mark had, in fact, phoned an Uber just minutes prior to his meeting with the manager. The judge's placid demeanor gave away little about her inclinations, even though she admitted the papers into evidence. The subtle maneuvers made Tiana's blood boil as she listened. Glancing back at the audience seats, she noticed 2 additional officers from earlier gazing at her with their arms folded. She pondered whether they had a suspicion that she wasn't just Mark's cousin. She pondered whether they understood that once she called forth the wave of her actual power, Their cunning intimidation techniques were inconsequential, like drops in the ocean of her resolve. Alicia took the stage to give Mark's version of events. Mark stood and narrated, his voice firm but his hands shaking. I had just left a study session at the library. I placed an Uber order. Since the store was well lighted, I felt safer standing outside than waiting in a dimly lit corner. I didn't believe I was acting improperly. In an attempt to portray Mark as elusive when questioned, the district attorney jumped in. However, the prosecutor's aggression was restrained by Alicia's prompt objections. After that, Alicia called a campus security officer, who verified that Mark had visited the library that night and had departed at the hour he had stated. Finally, Alicia gestured for the admission of the character statements from Mark's instructors, who described him as a conscientious learner who had never been afoul of the law. The judge let some of it for background context, despite the district attorney's insistence that it had nothing to do with the particular charge. Tiana sat silently through all of this, fighting the want to testify herself. She sensed, nevertheless, that Alicia might give her a call to determine Mark's general behavior or to gain further understanding of his viewpoint. However, Alicia had made no indication that she intended to do so. After all, unless Alicia chose to utilize Tiana's job at the White House, which Tiana had not revealed, her attendance as a relative may be interpreted as biased. Tiana heard T. Parker and his associates whispering and occasionally glancing in her direction in between testimonies. The knot in her stomach grew tighter. Did they have any plans? Or maybe they had heard of her before. Despite the adrenaline pulsing through her veins, she made an effort to maintain a composed front. Alicia carefully undermined the prosecution's tenuous story as the hearing progressed. Still, it was impossible to predict what a judge would decide. There are other ways to interpret the store manager's 911 call and the fact that Mark was behind the building, despite his claims that it was a well-lit location. Then something changed, and Alicia got up. On behalf of the defendant, Your Honor, the defense would like to call Miss Tiana Wallace as a character witness at this time. The courtroom was filled with a sense of surprise. Tiana stood up, albeit her eyes widened a little. Alicia must have determined that Tiana's credibility would support Mark's case, even if she had anticipated staying an observer. Tiana swallowed and walked over to the witness stand. With a vow to speak the truth, she held up her right hand. She was well aware that if she revealed her profession, the courtroom might be rocked by a wave of understanding. The bailiff gestured for her to take a seat. Miss Wallace, how do you know the defendant? Alicia started. Tiana's voice came out confident and firm. I'm a relative of Mark Freeman. Here in Washington, D.C., we grew up together. Can you comment on his personality? Tiana gave a nod. Mark is a committed learner. He has never acted in a way that would indicate criminal intent. His career goal is to work as a social worker, specializing on youth development initiatives. He has a strong desire to assist others. The district lawyer moved forward, prepared to contest. You're a relative, Miss Wallace, therefore you're definitely biased. Beyond your family connections, is there any reason the court should find you a reliable source? Tiana took a breath. Alicia probably had this moment in mind. She looked to Alicia, who gave her a barely noticeable nod. The district attorney was the next person Tiana looked at. Though the comments resonated around the courtroom, she answered quickly, I work in public engagement for the White House. There was silence, and the judge looked up, her interest piqued. T. Parker appeared to have taken a punch to the belly from his gallery seat. His eyes grew wide, as though he had finally seen Tiana's face in a White House staff photo or at some official event. The other officers started whispering to each other. An eyebrow was raised by the district attorney. White House interaction with the public. He sounded unsure. Could you give further details? Tiana smiled courteously yet firmly. I oversee outreach initiatives aimed at fostering closer linkages between underserved communities and governmental organizations. Among other things, I seek to close the gap between community organizations and law enforcement initiatives. As if a gigantic gear had just moved, the air felt electric. The district attorney made an effort to remain calm. Well, I respect your position, Miss Wallace. But are you personally aware of what transpired the evening of Mr. Freeman's arrest? No, Tiana said. I wasn't present. However, I am aware of Mark's routine and overall demeanor. He frequently studies late at the library at his university. On multiple instances, I have personally driven him home. I can also vouch for his adherence to the law. For 20 years, our late grandfather served with the Metropolitan Police Department. He was near Mark. Alicia jumped right in. Would you say that Mr. Freeman's malicious loitering behind a store is out of character? Yes, Tiana replied, looking directly into the judge's eyes. That seems very out of character to me. The judge glanced from Tiana to Mark and then to the prosecutor as she tapped her pen thoughtfully. Do you have any further questions for Miss Wallace, counsel? Evidently attempting to recover from the astonishment, the district attorney cleared his throat. No, Your Honor. Alicia gave a nod. I'm done asking, Your Honor. Tiana ignored the gathering of policemen glaring looks and stepped down from the witness stand. She could almost feel the fire of their incredulity and rage. When she was back in her seat, she dared to look at Parker. His mouth was clenched as he said something to the officer next to him. They were obviously uneasy at Tiana's revelation. Perhaps because they had treated her rudely in the corridor. Perhaps because they now understood that tampering with her could have repercussions outside of the courtroom. After glancing at the clock, the judge declared that there would be a little break before closing remarks. We'll meet again in 15 minutes. She tapped her gavel lightly and announced that court was in recess. Tiana let out a breath, attempting to control the whirlpool of feelings within her. You work for the White House? Mark whispered as he bent forward. I had no idea you were so high up. Tiana squeezed his arm in a comforting manner. Now, let's not worry too much about that. Keep your composure. We're doing well. Alicia collected her documents. In a few minutes, I'll see you both again here. I'll go speak briefly with the DA regarding a potential settlement. She quickly left, leaving Mark and Tiana alone for the time being. Tiana felt a heavy hand on her shoulder as she started to accompany Mark out of the courtroom. She looked at T. Parker, who had a fake smile on his face that stopped short of his eyes. The White House, he added softly. Mark stiffened, taking a defensive step toward Tiana, but she told him to keep his cool. Yes, she said in a measured tone. Officer, is there anything you require from me? Parker's knuckles turned white around his hat's brim. You have a lot of nerve to come in here and be that arrogant. He spoke sharply, but not loudly enough to catch the bailiff's notice. Tiana calmly maintained eye contact. The only reason I'm here is to help my cousin. I gave an honest statement. He twisted his lip. People like you believe that because of your connections, you can break the law. When this is all over, let's see if that remains the case. A glimmer of rage lit up Tiana's eyes. Yes, that's exactly what we're doing, she answered, her voice sharper than before, if by breaking the rules you mean presenting evidence and trusting due process. Regarding relationships, perhaps you ought to have thought about how you treat others before making assumptions about who I am and am not. Parker's nose wrinkled. Tiana was terrified that he might strike out physically or verbally. However, the bailiff's return appeared to restrain him. After muttering something, he pivoted on his heel and strode off. Mark gazed at Tiana with wonder and worry. He said, "You're playing with fire, T." She exhaled deeply. Her hands trembled a little, but she remarked that sometimes fire must meet fire. Although she realized that Parker's hostility could make matters more difficult, she also understood that there was no going back now. On the table were the cards. Mark was pacing nervously out in the corridor, while Tiana was trying to keep her composure. Every new discovery has the potential to change the course of events in unanticipated ways, making the legal system a place of tension and opportunity. And pressure was nothing new to Tiana. She had handled heated policy discussions involving billions of dollars and innumerable lives. But this seemed more intimate than anything else. When she looked up, she saw Alicia coming toward her, her brow slightly furrowed. According to Alicia, the DA isn't changing their offer. I told him no, but he still wants Mark to accept a plea. Since Mark didn't do anything wrong, he shouldn't be in a diversion program. In closing arguments, we will battle it out. Tiana's jaw was fixed as she nodded. We ought to. Are we strong enough to prevail? Alicia let out a sigh. I think so. Despite the lack of tangible proof of a burglary attempt, the phone logs and testimonials are compelling. The only issues are the officer's word and the store manager's assertion, which may be taken seriously. However, your remarks undoubtedly improved Mark's reputation. Mark sank onto a bench and rubbed his temples with his fingers. It's unbelievable that they would attempt to destroy my life for such a thing. Tiana patted his shoulder as she sat next to him. "We're battling because of this." The bailiff declared that the hearing will resume a few moments later. Devoted to completing this, Tiana, Mark, and Alicia went back to the courtroom. Parker's recall to the stand at the prosecution's request, supposedly to explain some of his early testimony, was something Tiana hadn't expected. Parker sat down once more, his taut, seething energy making Tiana's stomach turn. In order to confirm timing and distances, the district attorney followed up with a series of harmless questions. "Officer Parker, did the defendant or his associates exhibit any signs of hostility or unusual behavior that night?" he said very nonchalantly. Parker hesitated, allowing his eyes to stray to Tiana. "As you may imagine, the defendant initially resisted our commands to move away from the back entrance. Indeed, I remember his bringing up a cousin who, quote, had ties to the government. He pretended that his behavior was meant to scare us." Tiana tensed. She had never been mentioned by Mark. She knew for sure. Parker was making up stories to discredit her testimony. The statement caught the district attorney's attention. Therefore, it was suggested that the situation might be influenced by outside forces. "Exactly," Parker said in a tone full with implication. "We have witnessed that strategy before." Alicia jumped up. "Your Honor, I object. This testimony is unsupported and speculative." The judge turned to Parker and scowled. "Do you have any proof for this assertion, officer?" Parker gave a fake, nonchalant shrug. "Me and my partner alone." He said that, and we both heard. "I stand by what I said." Tiana's thoughts were racing. By conveniently connecting it to Tiana's position in the White House, Parker was trying to portray Mark as a threat to the police with powerful connections. The judge's gaze grew strained. "Okay, I'll give the statement permission, but only under strict supervision. Cross-examination is an option for defense." With a look of controlled rage, Alicia walked over to the podium. "When precisely did Mr. Freeman allegedly bring up this cousin with ties to the government, Officer Parker?" Parker stated calmly, "I think it was shortly after we discovered him behind the store, before we put him in handcuffs." "And in your formal police report, you said this?" Parker paused. "I can distinctly recall that, but it may have been unintentionally left out." Alicia reached into her folder, opened it, and took out a copy of the police report. "Nothing about Mr. Freeman threatening to utilize political power is mentioned, Your Honor. Would you agree that that is an important detail to omit?" Parker's expression tensed. "Our shift was quite hectic. In the final report, details may occasionally be overlooked." Alicia leaped. "So, in your testimony, you neglected to include a potentially important statement made by the defendant that would have pointed to an effort at bribery or intimidation." The cop folded his arms. "It's true, but it doesn't mean it's false." Alicia's frustration was palpable to Tiana. They had sown the seeds of distrust. However, the judge might still be influenced by Parker's flagrant deception if she thought an officer wouldn't just make up testimony. Mark whispered as he leaned toward Tiana at the defense table. "I swear I never said that." Tiana patted his hand and murmured softly, "I know." "He's telling lies." With a barrage of incisive questions, Alicia concluded her cross-examination, severely undermining Parker's credibility. Nevertheless, the harm was done. The claim has been heard by the court. And it hung in the air like a bad odor, despite the fact that it was obviously unfounded. When Parker eventually resigned, Alicia asked if she may call another witness, Dr. Aaron Whitman, a professor of Mark's who had just arrived. The judge gave his approval. Dr. Whitman confirmed the approximate time Mark left campus by testifying that he was in his class that evening. His statements reinforced the defense's version of events by confirming the timetable based on the phone records. The judge signaled that she was prepared to hear closing arguments following Dr. Whitman's testimony. Reiterating that Mark had been discovered under questionable circumstances, the district attorney noted that his presence had intimidated both the police and the store manager. Alicia responded with a methodical, logical refutation. Phone logs, the testimony of the professor, the absence of tangible proof, and the officer's story's dubious inconsistencies. As Tiana listened, her heart raced. All of their efforts culminated in this. The consequences for Mark may be severe if the judge decided against him. Missed professional possibilities, a criminal record, and maybe probation. She resisted the need to get up and yell Parker's lies down. The tension in the room was evident when the judge finally spoke. I have taken into account Officer Parker's testimony, the phone logs, the witness accounts, and the material that was provided. She stopped and looked around the courtroom. The onus is on the state to establish its position beyond a reasonable doubt. That burden, in my opinion, has not been fulfilled. Tiana, Mark, and Alicia felt a surge of relief. The judge went on. Consequently, the trespassing allegation is dropped. Mark buried his face in his hands and slumped with relief. Tiana blinked back tears and let out a grateful gasp. They had prevailed. But the judge had one more thing to say. I can't locate any reliable information to back up the accusation that there was an attempt to intimidate law enforcement by bringing up government links. However, I warn that it would be completely wrong if that were to happen. This issue is resolved. She rapped hard on the gavel. It ended abruptly when the clerk called for the next case. Alicia gave them each a back pat when Tiana put her arms around Mark. Mark, she replied, you're free, free, free. With a feeling of exultation, they collected their things and made their way to the exit. However, Tiana's triumph was short-lived when she saw T. Parker standing close to the entrance, staring at her. His expression was black with rage, as if he had been personally offended by Mark's acquittal. She was half expecting him to say something snide. Rather, he just gazed, his message unmistakable. It's not over yet. Alicia said goodbye to them outside the courtroom and promised to follow up on any last-minute paperwork. Despite a hint of caution in his eyes, Mark's smile would not go away. He hugged her and repeated, "You saved me, T." Tiana ruffled his hair and chuckled softly. That is the purpose of family. Just swear to me that you will never longer loiter outside of strange shops. He gave a humorous roll of his eyes. It wasn't random, it was well lit. But I swear, sure. Tiana's phone rang before they left. She gave the screen a quick look. It was her office in the White House. Excusing herself, she moved aside to respond. It was Linda Moreno, her boss. I understand that you had to take the day off for personal reasons, Tiana. Are you okay? Yes, things are all right now. My cousin's court things. Linda paused. I'm happy to hear that you're doing well. Listen, we have a minor issue with the Metropolitan Police Department's liaison program. There was a major misunderstanding regarding the community event next week. Do you think you could help resolve this tomorrow? Tiana suppressed a sour chuckle at the irony. I will be there, of course. After thanking her, Linda hung up. Tiana went back to Mark, who nudged her lovingly. White House trouble. She gave a shrug. I'll take care of it, it's just some event planning nonsense. She had no idea that addressing it would place her and T. Parker at danger of colliding sooner rather than later. Tiana scanned her pass at the security checkpoint as she arrived to the Eisenhower Executive Office building the following morning. She was already full of ideas for the policing project Linda had suggested, and she was dressed comfortably in flats and a fitting jacket. She passed by a hallway filled with old photos, many of which showed instances of police enforcement and federal officials working together. Tiana stopped when she saw a 1963 photograph of police chiefs and civil rights leaders together. It made her realize how far the nation had come and how far it still had to go. In the tiny meeting room, Linda welcomed her. Good morning, Tiana. I appreciate you coming in so quickly. She gestured to the long table and added, the rest of the MPD team is here, but the assistant police chief is running late. Her blood froze as Tiana drew closer. Officer T. Parker sat close to the end of the table, wearing a suit instead of a uniform, perhaps for this formal gathering. As their gazes met, Tiana noticed a flash of bewilderment and then barely controlled rage on his face. Linda looked from one to the other. Do you know Officer Parker, Tiana? Tiana forced a neutral expression as she swallowed hard. Yes, we have met. Tiana became aware that Parker had not yet entirely come to terms with who she was. It was one thing to learn yesterday that she was employed at the White House, but it was another to witness her in this setting, surrounded by influential people, including his bosses. His whole expression was one of uneasiness. The meeting started. Linda presented the subjects of collaborative training sessions, community engagement initiatives, and building trust in underprivileged areas. Tiana dominated the conversation by bringing up statistics and suggested policies. With his arms folded across his chest, Parker remained mute while the other officers were open to conversation. After a while, Linda faced him. You've previously been involved in some of these outreach initiatives, Officer Parker. Any suggestions? He looked at Tiana as he moved in his chair. He voiced taut, I think we need to be careful about who we partner with. These community organizers occasionally have personal goals. We do not wish to serve the political interests of others. Tiana inhaled deeply. That's why we carefully screen each partner, she said in a level voice. Building mutual trust is the aim, not advancing any covert objective. Parker gazed at her. Yes, he said softly, if that trust is reciprocated. Sensing the tension, Linda attempted to change the subject. About the training modules, that is. Tiana was aware, however, that Parker's animosity was far from gone. Tiana was summoned aside by Linda after the meeting. Are you all right? There appears to be some unsaid conflict between you and Officer Parker. Tiana gritted her teeth and smiled. We have some history, but it shouldn't get in the way of the work. Linda's eyebrow went up. Okay, just exercise caution. Parker has the ear of a few high-ranking officials, and we need MPD on board completely. Thanking Linda for her concern, Tiana nodded. She understood that successful implementation of these objectives required a careful balancing act. I'll keep it professional, I get it. But Parker has no intention of being professional. When she left that afternoon, he was waiting for her outside the building, leaning against a squad car that had arrived to pick him up. Tiana said, "Hello, Parker," more out of politeness than affection. He straightened up. Miss Wallace, I assume you feel like a boss now and are dictating to us how to perform our duties. Her eyes narrowed. I'm attempting to assist. I get what you're attempting. He stepped closer and interrupted her. People who believe they can exploit their position to avoid responsibility ultimately learn a terrible lesson, as I warned you. Her heart was thumping in Tiana's ears. Is that dangerous? He scoffed. It's true. Let's see how long you can continue that, even if you may have managed to get your cousin off. That was sufficient. Tiana's shoulders went square. Officer Parker, I advise you to politely discuss any professional issues you may have with your superiors. Otherwise, we're done talking. With her heart pounding, she turned to leave. She was called after by Parker. When I'm done, you won't be so arrogant. For a brief moment, her steps faltered, but she declined to respond in a way that would have degraded his threat. Trying to calm the trembling sensation in her legs, she rushed to the metro station. By when I'm done, what did Parker mean? Was it idle rhetoric, or was he hinting at some kind of retaliation? Tiana spent the next few days engrossed in policy briefings and follow-up conversations on the outreach event that was coming up. She tried to be cool, but the anxiety that Parker's warning had caused would not go away. She carried on with her duties as usual, gathering information, liaising with charitable groups, and crafting speeches for department heads. But she felt like she was being watched, and she was always looking over her shoulder. Then one late evening, Tiana saw a familiar patrol car parked across the street as she was leaving the White House grounds. Parker appeared remarkably similar to the silhouette behind the wheel. Her heart pounded as she rushed across the street in the other direction. Was it a coincidence, or was he following her? She tried to talk sense into her head. Parker may have just been put in charge of the region. Nevertheless, she observed the same vehicle and the same menacing driver the following evening. So far, she hadn't told Linda or the Secret Service about it. She had to make sure that she wasn't dreaming. Mark called her in a panic the next morning. I think I'm being followed, he added, panting. Every time I step outside my apartment, a squad car passes by and slows down. Tiana gripped the phone more tightly. Have you noticed who it was? No, I was unable to get a clear view. However, I was looked down upon by the two officers in the front. This week, it occurred 3 times. Tiana became enraged. This went beyond resentment. Simply put, it was harassment. She had no intention of letting Parker or anybody else scare her family. It was time for her to do something about it. Closing the office door behind her, Tiana asked Linda for a private meeting the next day. Tiana started, telling the whole story. I need your help. Parker's attendance at the outreach meeting, Mark's arrest, the altercation in court, and now the possible harassment. Linda listened carefully, her face changing from worry to indignation. She firmly stated, "This is unacceptable. We cannot allow the very cops we are attempting to work with to intimidate a White House employee. Glad that Linda was paying attention, Tiana let out a sigh. However, I don't want it to turn into a controversy in the media. Mark won't benefit from that, and it could harm the outreach initiative. Linda gave a nod. I'll talk to the deputy administrator. No media, we'll set up a meeting with the police chief. We'll say nothing, but we'll be clear that this cannot go on. Tiana ended up in Assistant Police Chief Marion Hall's official office a day later. In order to keep Parker from knowing ahead of time, Linda had carefully planned the encounter. Hall's expression darkened as Tiana described the circumstances. With grimness, she added, I know Parker. On paper, he seems like a good officer, but I've heard he gets angry easily. I'll start an internal investigation to find out what's happening with these alleged patrols close to your cousin's house. Tiana put her hands on the table and spoke in a calm tone. Chief Hall, I'm not seeking revenge. All I want is for him to stop bothering my cousin and myself. Hall gave a nod. I get it. This is going too far if it is occurring as you suggest. I'll deal with it discreetly. If anything worsens in the interim, please get in touch with me right away. The harassment subsided for some time. Tiana didn't see Parker prowling close to her place of employment, and Mark reported no more odd drive-bys. She even let out a little sigh of relief. Parker was not the kind to admit defeat, but perhaps the internal evaluation had put him on notice. A week later, Tiana was on a little errand in the downtown area when she got stuck in a quiet side street close to the government building where she had gone to retrieve some documents. Parker was walking behind her as she made her way back to the main road. He grabbed her arm with enough power to cause her to gasp before she could get away. Do you believe you can surpass me? His eyes were wild as he spat. Tiana took a defensive step back and shrugged free his hold. Give me up, she insisted. He aimed a finger accusingly at her face. You said I was bothering you to my bosses. Do you realize the impact that has on an officer's record? Even though her heart was racing, she wasn't intimidated. I was being harassed by you. You're still, she retorted. If you do not retreat, I will file charges. Anger twisted his face. Make your huge threat now. You folks in the White House believe you are invincible. I never said that, Tiana responded, struggling to maintain her composure. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and held it up. But if you want to continue, I can videotape you now. He paused at that. He looked around for anyone who could have seen it. At the far end of the alley, a few people had emerged, but they were too far away to hear the action. Parker's voice fell to a threatening murmur. I am not afraid of your job. I'm sure you'll regret it if you or your cousin cross the line once more. Tiana was pointing the phone at him with a shaking hand. She claimed, I have this on video. Now leave me alone. With a scowl, he marched off while muttering curses. With adrenaline pumping through her veins, Tiana let out a breath. She called Linda as soon as she was certain he was gone. Tiana tried to catch her breath and stated, We have a big problem. Parker came up to me once again. The urgency in Linda's voice crackled. Return here. It's time for us to make a formal complaint. Shaken yet determined, Tiana made her way back to the White House compound. Assistant Police Chief Hall, who had hurried over after hearing Tiana's desperate plea, was waiting with Linda. Hall was enraged. As she paced Linda's office, she declared, That's assault, I'll have him suspended. Linda gave a nod. We need to take care of this right away. Will you make a complete statement, Tiana? After a moment of hesitation, Tiana nodded, yes. The legal complaint was filed in a matter of hours. Parker was suspended the next day while an inquiry was conducted. He became so furious that in a desperate attempt to exact revenge, he gave a local news organization a skewed account of what had happened, alleging that a senior White House employee was using her position to disparage a police officer. The narrative erupted. Even though Tiana's name wasn't first mentioned in official announcements, journalists were able to identify her. Tiana found herself in the middle of a media frenzy. She came across headlines that misrepresented the facts. A policeman alleges that the White House meddled in a local trespassing case. The political elite harassing a brave officer? As Tiana read the spin, she felt nauseous. Social media users talked about it. Parker is being commended by some for opposing corruption. His targeting of a black woman who happens to work in the White House has been criticized by others. Major media outlets began reporting the issue by the end of the week, requesting answers from the White House press office and the police department. Tiana ended up in a whirlpool she didn't want. Every night, she withdrew to her tiny apartment and shut off her phone to escape the flurry of calls. Concerned, her mother called. Reminding her that they were in this together, Mark sent her encouraging notes. However, when a piece of security footage, from a surveillance camera across the street from the alley, came to light, everything changed. If not the exact words, it captured his impassioned threats as Parker grabbed Tiana and she pushed him away. Parker's aggressive approach was confirmed by another camera perspective taken from a nearby company. As soon as this evidence was made public, the roles were reversed. News organizations repeatedly aired the video, this time with an explanation of Parker's deception about being the victim. The police force hurried to defend their procedures. Additionally, the White House press secretary called the officer's actions extremely troubling, without mentioning Tiana by name. Parker's career was in ruins by the time the Internal Affairs Department of the Police Department finished its review. A clear image of wrongdoing and misuse of authority was presented by the video, Tiana's testimony, and the prior accusations. Other residents came forward to report similar forms of intimidation and harassment. Assistant Chief Hall spoke in public. No officer is exempt from professional conduct standards. Officer Parker's employment with the Metropolitan Police Department has been terminated with immediate effect. From the White House break room, Tiana saw the press conference. She was feeling a range of feelings, including relief, vindication, grief that it had reached this point, and rage at Parker for taking it this far. Her co-workers gave her words of support. Mark sent her happy emojis via text. Linda patted her back, soothing her. Chief Hall personally visited Tiana later that day and apologized on the department's behalf. I reassured her that in order to combat the kind of prejudice and violence Parker had shown, new training initiatives were being implemented. Tiana thanked her and said she hoped their experience would lead to real reforms. The repercussions for Parker were severe and quick. Tiana's lawyers threatened to file a civil suit against him. Tiana was committed to ensuring accountability so that no other young black man or woman would have to endure Parker's intimidation, even though she wasn't asking for damages herself. He became a warning story in the media headlines. An officer whose own conceit ultimately brought him down used his badge as a tool to settle personal grudges. A month later, Tiana was positioned at a podium at a press conference aimed at young people at the White House briefing room. Her deliberate presence served as a declaration that she would not be sidelined or silenced. She started by recognizing the difficulties that many underprivileged communities encounter, the value of citizen police trust, and the strength of accountability. Parker was not specifically mentioned by her. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room was aware of her story's background. She articulately discussed how law enforcement and the community must be vigilant in order to bring about genuine change. The majority of officers serve with honor, she stressed, but regardless of how awkward it may be, abuses of authority must be addressed. Then, with her heart racing, she moved away from the podium. Mark was clapping and crying in the front row. There was her mother, too, beaming with delight. Linda received a standing ovation from her co-workers. Tiana understood that although the fight for equality and justice was far from complete, she had contributed to shifting the course slightly in the direction of righteousness. Reporters flocked about in the corridor afterward, hoping to get additional quotes. Tiana politely declined them, choosing instead to stick to her official statement. She slipped outside into the fresh evening air after finding a moment of silence. She recalled her father's remarks from years ago as she looked up at the White House silhouetted against the night sky. "You'll accomplish something significant here one day." The faint buzz of traffic from Pennsylvania Avenue was transported by a light breeze. Tiana gave herself a moment of appreciation as she closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. She had been threatened and treated disrespectfully, but she had refused to back down. Parker had been held responsible, and Mark's future was secure. Her father had been correct. One step at a time, she was contributing to the cause of justice in this city, and she was accomplishing something significant. From the halls of power within the White House to a courthouse hallway brimming with silent disdain, Tiana Wallace's story serves as a reminder that courage flourishes when convictions are strong. She broke past the barriers of silent discrimination and fought for justice for her cousin, refusing to give in to intimidation. And she refused to back down when Officer Parker's threats intensified, allowing the truth to be revealed at last. Her determination to hold people accountable regardless of their position of authority ultimately serves as a reminder that systemic change begins with every individual who has the courage to speak up. Those who misused their position of authority faced hard karma. For Tiana, however, the prize was much bigger: validation and a chance to speak up for people who couldn't speak for themselves. If Tiana's story has inspired you, please hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and empowering stories. Your assistance enables us to share important stories.